The Tom Woods Show, episode 1827.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. We're joined once again by the great Dominic Frisby, really one of my favorite guests. He is a British humorist and, I don't know, jack of all trades. I don't know how else to describe him. If you recall from one of his previous appearances, he went through and listed all the things he has done and does, and it's incredible. And he knows everything about everything, and he's just such a wonderful person to get to know. And his book, Daylight Robbery, is out in paperback in the United States this week. So I wanted to bring him back on and talk further about that book, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Now, I should tell you something about this particular interview. And I'm sorry, every once in a while, when you have almost 2,000 episodes and you're doing 5 of them a week, every once in a while something goes wrong. And with this one, I don't know what went wrong. The computer said it was using this microphone you're hearing me speak on right now. And for some reason, during the recording, it used the, dare I say it, could these words leave a podcaster's lips? The built-in microphone on the computer. Oh my gosh, I said it. So my audio quality is not what it could be. I mean, look, poor Chris Williams who does my audio. He does amazing things, but for heaven's sake, there's only so much a human being can do. So he's done everything he can to make me appear competent in this episode. But I wanted you all to know that somehow something just went wrong. But, you can still understand us just fine. It's no big deal, but it makes me crazy. And I just wanted you to know. So, having said that, we're about to have an absolutely delightful conversation with Dominic Frisby. And here is my interview with Dominic Frisby. Dominic Frisby, welcome back to the show.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
I have something that you are not expecting me to say that I want to tell you before we start talking about Daylight Robbery. And it's this. Just a few days ago, I posted a big album of photos of Jenna and me over on Facebook. And it's the first time a lot of my Facebook friends are even seeing her. So it's really fun. It shows us in different cities around the world. But in there is also a picture of just you and me, the picture she took of us after our lunch that time. And we were standing in front of some storefront, and there was a neon sign in the store that said, "Free People." And so that picture, now the point of this album is the two of us. That's the point. It's her and me and our travels around the world. The picture of you and me pretty much got more likes almost than all the other photos put together. I don't know why. But
I'm very photogenic.
That's just crazy.
It's because of the free people thing somehow.
It's got to be. Which was entirely a coincidence.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things you can read into that. Some good, some bad.
All right, let's talk about Daylight Robbery. So coming out, it's out in paperback in the U.S. this week, and so we want to revisit it. But I want to do something a little unusual. I want to start off a little bit closer to the end of the book, if I may, just because of what's in the news. Now, obviously, what's in the financial news lately has been the whole Reddit and GameStop thing. But before that, because in the past couple of months, Bitcoin just exploded in terms of price. All of a sudden, once again, people were interested in cryptocurrency. When it hit nearly 20,000 several years ago, and then it fell back a bit, we had a lot of commentators saying, well, hope you sold because it's never going to jump back up again. And then it did. It basically doubled that amount for a while, and now it's sitting in the 30,000s in US dollars. So the reason I bring that up is you have a chapter, and you start off talking about a company paying people in crypto, and actually in Bitcoin Cash in this case. And I'm curious to have you talk to us about how that fits into a book on taxation, given that in the U.S., technically speaking, you are supposed to report your gains that you've made from Bitcoin to be taxed on them, which is a kind of an imposition on Bitcoin. It makes it harder to use above board as a medium of exchange. So can you sort all that out?
With pleasure. By the way, that US law that demands that American citizens, wherever they are in the world, if they want to remain American citizens, have to still carry on paying taxes to the US and fill in their forms. So even if you haven't been in the US, for 25 years and you live in Japan or Nigeria or wherever it is, you still have to declare your tax in the US. That law goes all the way back to the Civil War. and Abraham Lincoln keenly protecting every little cent of tax revenue he could in order to pay for the war effort. And it was one of those things, like many tax laws, it brought in as a temporary measure and it stayed forever. But anyway, coming back to your initial point about cryptocurrency, I have a chapter in the book. By the way, it's a little known fact because the book was never released in the US, but I actually wrote the first book about Bitcoin back in 2014, the first book from a recognized publisher. So I've always been fairly close to the subject. But my book, Daylight Robbery, is about the past, the present, and the future of taxation. And so there's a chapter in the future section called Crypto, the Taxman's Worst Nightmare. And even though you are still duty bound to report your taxes if you're an American citizen, that same law doesn't apply to citizens of other countries if they leave their home country. But I talk about the future of employment, and I see a huge rise of the digital nomad and remote working. And obviously the trend for remote working has been dramatically accelerated in a way that I could never have foreseen because of COVID-19. But it looks like even before COVID-19 happened, I was looking at maybe there being by 2035 as many as 1 billion workers around the world who will be remote workers and slightly nomadic, and they'll travel from country to country in many cases. And it won't necessarily be clear who they pay taxes to because they're traveling folk, digital nomads. And if I'm doing say I'm English, but I'm living in Thailand and I'm doing a job, for a guy in Japan, and then by the time I finish the job, I've gone to South America, it's not entirely clear to whom I should pay tax. And this is the lot of the digital nomad. And also, it's just a lot easier when you're transacting on the internet, which is essentially a borderless medium, to transact in a borderless currency. And of course, cryptocurrency is a borderless money. When you want to send fiat money across borders, it's just problematic. So for that reason, I just see a dramatic acceleration in the adoption of cryptocurrencies. And when people are transacting in currencies that are not controlled by government, straight away, it becomes much harder for a government to tax and regulate the economy. So it's that simple dynamic. Now, of course, you can demand that people report their trades and pay the due taxes on them. But it's a very different dynamic taxing people at source, which is currently how most taxes are collected. And many people won't report just because they don't want to, simple fraud or whatever you want to call it. But there are a lot of people who work as freelancers. It's documented that they pay, even if they're doing the same job, if they work in the gig economy, if they're doing the same job as somebody who doesn't work in the gig economy, they tend to pay much lower rates of tax, often just through incompetence or administrative negligence. But anyway, so the short answer to your question is a world in which cryptocurrencies are much more widely used and adopted is a world that is much harder to tax and regulate.
Okay, I had a feeling that the answer was more or less something like that. And at some point, I probably do need to revisit the crypto subject of my show. But let's go back now more into the past. And I want to try to cover topics that are different from the ones we covered the first time I had John talk about the book. Let's go into U.S. history a little bit. But you, as a Brit, are allowed to comment on this aspect of U.S. history because it involves you guys, okay? So let's talk about the American War for Independence. What the average American schoolboy learns is the phrase "no taxation without representation," and that's pretty much what they know about the War for Independence. Now, obviously, taxation played a major role in that conflict. There was a larger constitutional issue at stake, but really, taxation is what people noticed in their daily lives. Is there anything about that story that your book tells in some way differently, or are you just highlighting that here, once again, is a major historical episode that centers around taxation?
Well, just about every rebellion, revolt, revolution in history has been a revolt against some kind of perceived economic injustice perpetrated by the tax system. And, tax is a form of control. And if an emperor or a king or a government loses control of their tax revenue, essentially they lose their power. And it was already pretty well documented that, one wonders if that War of Independence would have come anyway. because basically Americans didn't want to be answerable to the English. But it was injudicious and unnecessarily high levels of taxation. And it wasn't just the high levels of taxation, it was the manner in which they were collected and the inconsiderate ways by which Westminster legislated against the colonies and sort of treated Americans like you were sort of one of the African colonies rather than, whereas Americans, on the other hand, felt that they had rights that were sealed in Magna Carta, which was another result of another tax revolt, the Barons' Rebellion back in the 1200s. And, this idea that they had the same rights as an Englishman, and then those rights were violated by the English. So that war in many ways wasn't so much a fight for new rights. It was a fight to keep rights that Americans, I don't even know if they would then be called Americans, but they believed, the colonists believed were inherent. And so that's the story there. But, I probably do 3 or 4 pages on the American Revolution. I do a lot of time on the French Revolution. There was the Philippine Revolution that happened there, that the leader exhorted citizens to tear up their tax certificates. A nice little story there. And also, I talk quite a bit about the American Civil War, but I'm not going to talk about it now because I'll tell you why. Because people don't like to be told about their history by somebody with from a different place, by somebody with a different accent. But I've spent a great deal of time on the American Civil War trying to tell that story through the perspective of taxes. And I believe I throw a very interesting new light onto that Civil War that isn't taught in schools. And I'll just sort of dangle that little carrot at your listeners, Tom, and invite them to read without going into any depth as we speak now.
Well, let's say, if you don't mind, let's talk about the French Revolution, because neither of us is French. Neither of us speaks with a French accent. But as far as I know, there are no French people around at the moment. So, well, there could be some listeners, I suppose. But I think we can get away with it. Obviously, I would think there are 2 ways of figuring taxation into this story. Number one, it's obviously a revenue crisis that leads to the calling of the Estates General in the first place. And then secondly, the new regime desperately has to search around for taxation. So what can we say about the French Revolution? And by the way, actually, no, I don't want to anticipate your answer. Let's just leave it there.
Well, the seeds of the French Revolution went back many decades, lots and probably even over a century, lots and lots of injudicious wars overseas, very expensive, had to be paid for, an extremely decadent ruling class who had total contempt for the lower orders and just tax after tax after tax, pernicious taxes. And, it was it's not too dissimilar to a lot of the anger that pervades the West today, is that there's a sort of struggling working class who can see this incredibly decadent ruling class, and there seems to be no way of getting from one class to the other, if you know what I mean. And they see one class of people living decadently, and while they're struggling to make ends meet. And, it just went on and on and on. And eventually, there was like 5 different taxes on wine. For the Frenchman, it was like the land was taxed, the vine was taxed, at different stages of the harvest it was taxed, and then the wine itself was taxed. And this is in France, that lives off wine, and many peasants had to ended up just drinking cider instead because they couldn't afford the taxes on wine. And there was another one, the salt tax, the gabelle, and eventually it was just the accumulated effect of all these pernicious taxes, coupled with a corrupt and decadent ruling class, and it was just too much. And eventually they tried to negotiate. The rulers basically screwed them over in the negotiations, and so the people spoke, and we had a mini GME, a little. I think that crisis, by the way, last week with the video games retailer GME, it was a symptom of the same thing. This idea of socking it to the man.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And it's hard to get a handle on that situation because I think there are people of widely divergent ideological backgrounds who came together on that. And it'd be interesting to draw the Venn diagram of what they all share in common and where they all differ, because I think there are some people who are quite libertarian who were attracted to that. And I think there may also have been people who were more attracted to the Occupy Wall Street movement. So it's interesting, and it's not clear how that ends or where it's going to go next, what types of turns it'll take. But the way the U.S. establishment responded to it, I think, seemed to confirm the suspicions of all of them. Elizabeth Warren is a U.S. senator who ran for president as a progressive, and her first instinct was to talk about hedge funds and how irresponsible it was of these GameStop people to be doing what they were doing with the stock. And some of them said, now do you see the real nature of some of these people? So it's been very interesting over here.
Yeah, I love the way that when something emerges, for a start, it was just such a fantastic story of the little guy socking it to the man. And so every different ideology was trying to own it.
Yeah, of course, everybody wants to say that's our movement. Isn't that something?
Yeah, it's funny. But it's also interesting how when we had Brexit, this weird alliance over the Brexit argument in the UK between what would be the old Bennite left, which would be the sort of, I suppose your closest guys, Bernie Sanders, that kind of far left thing, and the old Thatcherite right. And they were both allied in their dislike of the, for 30 years, that left and right, sort of libertarian right and Bennite left, or the Bernie Sanders left, have been at loggerheads over just about every issue there is, because one wants more government control and wants governments to provide the solution, and the other thinks government's the problem. But there was this weird alliance over Brexit, and I guess that story there is a similar example. I think this is a fundamental flaw, actually, of that sort of hardcore left, of socialism generally, is that they believe in, if you look at something like Bitcoin, it's the most fantastic collective movement. Everyone who gets involved in Bitcoin, whether they're a computer programmer or they're a communicator or whatever their skill is, once they've invested in Bitcoin, they apply their skill to Bitcoin to promote it in whatever way they can. And so as a result, Bitcoin gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It's this incredible collective movement. So it's a great testament to collectivism. Now, collectivism is a socialist thing, but Bitcoin's about as libertarian a thing as you could possibly have. The big difference is that Bitcoin, everyone's collectively volunteered. No one's been coerced into doing anything. Everyone's volunteered. Whereas a lot of those left-wing guys who want collective solutions to things want that collectivism made imposed. They want it by law. It's quite an authoritarian collectivism, which never works as well. And I just often wish I could sit down that sort of far left and say, look, we want the same things. We want, meritocracies, equality of opportunity and all the rest of it. But the way to achieve it is less government, not more government. But I doubt they'd listen.
Hey, folks, let's take a quick moment to thank a sponsor that's totally appropriate for an episode with Dominic Frisby, who is a great champion of cryptocurrency, and that is BitTrust IRA. Obviously, Bitcoin has been performing very well, and no doubt people are looking to add Bitcoin to their retirement accounts. But the cryptocurrency world can be confusing, and it can be hard to know exactly how to dip your toe into it. Well, if you're looking to diversify your portfolio toward new innovative investments, BitTrust IRA is going to help you. They can seamlessly and securely add cryptocurrency to your portfolio. They store your private keys in nuclear bunkers with military-grade encryption. They have a 24/7 trading platform with no minimum investments and unlimited trades, plus a team to help guide you along the way if you have any questions. They also offer the lowest trading fees in the industry. So check them out. Go to bitrustira.com/woods today to learn more. And for a limited time, BitTrust IRA is waiving the sign-up fee. For Tom Woods Show listeners, that's a $50 value. That's bitrustira.com/woods. BITRUSTIRA.com/woods. I've heard it said by some people, and maybe this is also being captured in the modern monetary theory movement, that strictly speaking, governments, or at least some governments, don't really need taxation, strictly speaking, that they could print the money that they need, and that in fact what they use taxation for, they don't need it to pay their bills because they have a legal tender currency that they can print at will. Yes, the MMT people do not say inflation is not a potential problem. They do, but they're saying that a state can create money, pay its bills that way, and that taxation this is not necessarily a modern monetary theory thing, but it certainly goes along with their outlook. Taxation is something we can use to bring about various social engineering goals we may have. We may want to improve or we may want to attack inequality, let's say. So we'll use the tax system to take from some people and give to other people. But we don't really need it as a revenue source these days. That's what the MMT people would say. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and in fact, what the MMT people say is that we will print the money and then we will use taxation to stop inflation further down the road. So there can't be inflation because you won't have the money to buy stuff because we will have taxed it off you first.
Well, that's a relief.
So I hear that argument. I've followed that argument, but I don't buy it because it involves more government planning. And the evidence of today and throughout all of history is that the aggregation of lots and lots of individual decisions made in a free market results in a better outcome than government planning. So, look at, gold and Bitcoin are both much better systems of money than fiat money. And MMT will just lead to more fiat and more debasement of currency. It will be an acceleration of it. And, the one thing about quantitative easing, quantitative easing created such economic inequality because those further up those closest to the soup station got their soup first before it had been diluted, proper Cantillon effect. And MMT will just create so many market distortions and inequalities and special interest groups. Yeah, I want my little bit of funding. I want my little bit of subsidy. And then, so subsidy comes into a business and it creates all sorts of injustices and economic distortions, and it creates less economic inequality because some guys get the subsidy and some don't. It will end very badly, is my view. But they're already doing it. It's MMT and this other one, UBI, Universal Basic Income.
Yeah.
They're both basically coming in by the back door.
Yeah, I know. I'm surprised it hasn't gone faster, given the radical changes that have been made. We've had these emergency stimulus bills that involve sending people what in the grand scheme of things for an individual is a trivial amount of money, but on a countrywide basis is a huge amount of money. But there still are people calling for universal basic income. I don't know if that's going anywhere or not. And I don't know if by 2022 the country's going to be tired of the Democrats, and that may also put a halt to that kind of thing. I want to mention something that I saw the other day. To this day, we get people in the U.S. who are very unhappy with, of all people, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan seems like a lifetime ago at this point. But they referred to his tax policy as trickle-down economics. Now, there's nobody who advocated that policy who called it trickle-down economics. So the general rule in journalism is supposed to be that you call people by the name they choose for themselves. So, you call the pro-life movement the pro-life movement. You don't call it the anti-this or that. You call it what they want to be called. Well, no one in the Reagan movement spoke of trickle-down economics, but they all call it that in the media. And they think that what was being said was that if we lower the top marginal income tax rates, this will help poor people. Well, very indirectly, I think it will help poor people because it will help the whole society. But what can you, as the author of a book on the subject of taxation, say about this kind of thing, whether it's the way it's portrayed or the way it's understood or whether this works or not? This idea that top marginal tax rates may be too high and it could actually benefit not just those people, but all of society if we lower them.
Well, again, the evidence of I'm in favor of tax cuts in whatever form they take. Not only are we taxed too much, there are too many different sorts of taxes. So whether it's the UK or Europe or the US, we need fewer taxes, lower taxes, and simpler taxes. And, the evidence of history is that taxation is a measure of freedom. And you do have overall, I think your tax in the US is around about 40% of GDP. And here in the UK, we're closer to 50%. But, at one extreme, you have anarchy and you have no taxes whatsoever. And at the other extreme, you have, totalitarian states where, very little of one's labor is owned. The government owns everything, North Korea or something. And, those are the sort of the two extremes, and the social democrat countries are somewhere in the middle of the two. But the evidence of history is that the countries with the highest level of freedom, whether that's economic freedom or freedom of speech or freedom of movement, whatever type of freedom it is, have become the most innovative, the most inventive, the most wealthy. And it's not just the people at the top that get wealthy. That wealth trickles down to everyone. And the perhaps the greatest example we have of this, recent example we have of this is Hong Kong, which, its overall tax burden in the second half of the 20th century never exceeded 14%, 14% of GDP. Only the highest earners paid any income tax at all. Most people paid none. And shortly after World War II, Hong Kong was broken. It had a population of about 500,000. Its per capita GDP was on a par with most of Africa. And, by the 1990s, its population was 8 million. It went from 500,000 to 8 million. Everyone from everywhere went to Hong Kong. Its per capita GDP was in excess of the UK, and it even overtook the USA. Now, on the other side of the equation, it's not like Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, by the way, just had a low symbol of tax, and its tax code is about 1% the length of the UK's. So not only did it have low taxes, it had simple taxes, and it taxed land rather than labour, which is another interesting issue. But by 2000, or just after, Hong Kong had a higher per capita GDP than the USA, and on the supply side, its education is in the top 3 education in the world. It's the healthiest country in the world, or in the top 3 healthy countries in the world. Its transport system is one of the best in the world. I think it's like the second best in the world, and it's studied by countries everywhere on how to make a public transport system. So, it's not like it lost out. On the other, people go, we need high taxes to pay for education or healthcare, whatever it is. We don't, because Hong Kong proves that. Its outcomes were better at every level of the economy. And people voluntarily, a bit like Bitcoin, voluntarily moved to Hong Kong in order to better their lot. They worked hard, they were able to keep what they worked for, and the result was a better life for them and their descendants.
Let me close with this kind of question. You've got plenty of material on it in your book, and it's a huge one, so you figure out how you want to answer this. But how does war play into the history of taxation? In the sense that, I know that during wartime you pay more taxes, but is there anything that lingers from these experiences even after the wars are over?
Yeah, there is not a single war in history that wasn't paid for with taxes of some kind. Now, of course, in olden days, before money was widespread, tax was not always paid in kind. It was often it wasn't always paid in money. It was paid in kind. You had to give a share of your produce or a share of your labor. But there has not been a single war in history that wasn't paid for with tax of some kind, either during the event or afterwards. You plunder and then you tax the conquered nation. And this goes right back to ancient Mesopotamia through to the war in Iraq today. And if you want to limit a ruler's ability to wage war, then the easiest way to do that is limit the amount they are able to tax. Tax makes war possible. And it's the reverse cycle. Not only does tax make war possible, war makes more taxes possible. Because another evidence of history is it's very hard to raise taxes in peacetime. You need some kind of emergency, and a war provides the emergency you need to raise the higher levels of taxes. Before the Revenue Act of 1942, ordinary Americans didn't pay income tax. Only the highest earners did. And income tax was only brought in, to pay for World War II. But after World War II, and this is after every war, taxes never go back to the level they were at before the crisis started. They come back a bit, but they never go back to where they were before. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies in the UK calls this the Ratchet Effect. And so there's this sort of weird relationship between war and tax and war.
As an American, I can say that in 2003, of course, we had the war in Iraq, but the average American just didn't really feel the consequences of that. We didn't, if anything, at least marginal income tax rates came down, I think, under George W. Bush. So it seemed like it was free, so the war was able to go on because no one felt any consequences from it.
You're ignoring, Tom, one of the biggest taxes of the lot, which is what Milton Friedman calls taxation without legislation, which is, of course, inflation.
Right.
That is debasing money to pay for, in the case of the US, often wars. So they did the same with Vietnam. They debased the currency to pay for it, ended up having to leave the gold standard. And, it's just another form of taxation. Goes by another name, but it is a way to extract wealth.
And of course, even if consumer prices don't rise a whole lot, the point is they probably should have been falling. I mean, we're living through, with in the age of the internet and technological advance, an age of extraordinary explosions in productivity, the likes of which we could hardly have imagined. It would seem to me that prices should be tumbling through the floor. And so the fact that they're only rising slightly does not refute the claim that inflation is at work. It's at work because prices aren't lower than they are. The way they are, for example, they still are in technology and computers, but that should be happening in other places.
Yeah, the 19th century, when the UK was on a gold standard, saw the purchasing power of gold against ordinary consumer goods, there was deflation for 100 years. In other words, the purchasing power of money increased. And that enabled the working classes, or the peasants as they were at the beginning of the century, to work and improve their lot and gradually educate their children and enter the middle class and basically rise up. And fiat money, there is no inflation in Netflix videos or Domino's pizza, or what inflation there is fairly minimal, because none of these things are in short supply, and the improved productivity in all these areas forces down prices. So really, prices should be a lot lower than they are. Where there is inflation is in prices in areas where goods are scarce. So art, there's only one of these paintings. And so you see runaway inflation. Manhattan real estate, beachfront property in, I don't even know, Florida or something. An Ivy League education, school fees, all these areas where there's not the same deflationary forces at work, you are seeing rampant runaway inflation. But none of these things come up in official government measures. So the government can say, no, they call it CPI, it's prices are falling, we can carry on printing money. But, if I want, if I want a bond that yields me 50 grand a year, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that bond would have cost me £1 million, $1 million, and I get 50 grand a year in yield. Now, if I want 50 grand a year in yield, it's going to cost me $10 million. And they say there's no inflation. There's inflation in the stuff that you want and not in the stuff that you have.
Yes, exactly right. And then, of course, another fact about life under the gold standard in your country or mine was that in those days, I didn't have to think to myself, well, to save for my retirement, I better invest in some mutual fund, or I better put my money in X or Y. If I wanted to be super conservative, all I had to do was simply accumulate the cash.
Yeah.
And it would hold or gain value. That's all I had to do. Most people don't belong in the stock market. They don't know enough about financial instruments. And that's not a knock at them. It's just reality. Most people don't know anything about 99% of topics. And in order just to break even, they have to get into potentially dangerous areas they know nothing about. And that's an unspoken cost of the current system.
And it's just totally unnecessary. Wouldn't it be nice if you could do a day's work, lock in a fee for the energy you've expended doing that day's work, lock in that energy, and then for that energy to be able to expend that energy 1 or 10 or 15 years later, and it to have exactly the same energy as it had, when you did that day's work. And fiat money doesn't do that. It used to, but not anymore.
Yes, no kidding. Yeah, okay.
Gold was stored energy.
Well, listen, I've done so many episodes on gold and sound money, and I've done episodes on cryptocurrency. We could easily get drawn into an endless loop on these topics if I don't put a halt to it. But before we depart for today, I hope I can prevail on you to answer me a question that's not directly related to your book. And as an author, I don't always appreciate that as the ending question, but I assure you I'll make a great push for daylight robbery if you just answer this question, okay? I just want to know, as somebody who does not, who lives in the United States, but yet who would love to go back to London sometime. I know things have been crazy over there, but I also know I think you probably have more publicly outspoken people about the problems of the lockdowns than we have here. Our politicians, even our Republican Party politicians, are generally mute about this. But I see some people over there speaking with great outrage and quite a bit of knowledge about the situation. How do you assess where things are? And do you think that, with vaccination or whatever, that things are going to turn around? What's your prediction?
Well, I'm not wildly positive, Tom. I must say there are quite a few lockdown skeptics, as they're known, but they've been quite easy to dismiss because you just simply put blood on their hands for saying that perhaps government policy isn't the right policy. And people just go, well, people are dying, and therefore we have to lock everything down. I'm very cynical about how effective measures have been, and I just see particularly the under 25s, my kids, for example. My eldest daughter's she's basically lost her last 2 years of school, being at home all the time, and it's just really not good for her. My son's lost his first year at university. My 14-year-old son, who's just literally just needs to go, he's like a dog, he just needs to go outside and run around. That's what he needs to do, and he can't do that with his friends because of these lockdowns. So I think it's having terrible effects. And I mentioned earlier with the tax thing is when there's a crisis, government controls get greater. And then when the crisis is over, they never go back to the levels they were before. I think COVID-19 is a bit like that. And maybe, we've had some more outspoken critics, or maybe that just might be just people that you follow. But I've just see this huge land grab by government having taken place. And, once there's a land grab, it just doesn't go back. I think masks, for example, are just going to be a feature of our lives now. And, I get the argument that masks don't work because the particles are so small they get through and you touch your face more. And so as a result of wearing a mask, you actually might transmit the virus more. I get the other argument that you wear a mask not to protect you, but to protect other people. I get both sides of the argument. But it's just like, if I look at somebody and they've got a mask on, you can't make any they're antisocial, you can't make any contact with that person. And often they're looking at you and you're like, is he staring me out? Is he giving me dirty looks? Is he smiling at me? What's this guy doing here? So, we talk about the erosion of communities. I just think masks are another factor in that. So, I don't really know the answer to your question, Tom, but I'm a little bit worried about it's going to take us a long time to come back from this, put it that way. We have got the vaccine out there quicker than anyone else, it seems, apart from Israel. So I suppose the UK authorities should be credited for that. But now there's all sorts of arguments about how effective the vaccines actually are. And, so I'll wait and see. But you get two types of people. You get one type of person who's sort of a go-getter and, they learn on the job and they dive in and get their hands dirty. And those kind of people end up being sort of entrepreneurs and explorers and inventors and that kind of thing. And then you get another mindset of people who are very cautious. They look for permission rather than apologize afterwards. Their first instinct is always to say, no, you can't do that. And those kind of people go on and maybe become, civil servants or solicitors or something like that. And I guess in a healthy society, you need a balance of both of those two personality types. One type to push boundaries and the other to sort of rein them in a little bit. But public health is just being taken over by this, no, you can't do that mindset. And there's none of that sort of, there's just so much fear abounding that it's going to be a while before we can recover, in my opinion.
Now, very, very sad and frustrating. And
I'm not denying that the disease is dangerous, by the way. I'm not denying that for a second.
Yeah, you don't have to. You don't have to deny that. But at this point, how many years of your life is worth trading away for this? At what point do you say, look, we've been more than reasonable up to this point. We've burned through all our savings. We've ruined people's lives. We've ruined everything they've worked for. We've deprived ourselves of live music. We've deprived ourselves of the arts, all the things that make life worth living. Unless you're a hermit, these are things that we enjoy. It's just astonishing to me that more people aren't saying this. And that it's because they've been shamed. They've been shamed into saying what they are expected to say. But like people in live performance or whatever, instead of saying, well, let's see if there's some way, some middle ground we could try to reach. It's let's shame anybody who thinks I should go back to having a living again. Let's shame the people who are trying to help me. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's going on. It's like mad. They just smear you. You've got blood on your hands, mate.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, listen, I want to recommend very strongly people check out Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future by Dominic Frisby here, because as you can hear talking to Dom, he's not the kind of guy who's going to write a boring book, right? So this is knowledge that you want to have, but you don't want to slog through it if it's written by some hideous textbook author. No. The prose leaps off the page at you, just like a Tom Woods Show appearance by Dom Frisby does, okay? So go pick it up. I'm going to link to it on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1827. And here's hoping you and I can take another picture in London sometime that gets even more likes than the previous one. Thanks a lot.
I'd like that very much, Tom. Thank you.
All right, folks, a couple things to tell you about. I've got an event coming up in California, but the details are to be found either in my newsletter or in my private group, the Tom Woods Show Elite. Now, you got to be on my newsletter list anyway. You should be anyway. TomWoods.com/Corona will get you on there, and we'll also send you my PDF of trustworthy sources on the virus. So that's a nice little bonus to get when you get on my list. This would be sort of near Irvine, California, is what I'll say for now. I have a post about it and a link in the private group, the MeWe group, for the Tom Woods Show Elite. If you want to join that, which you should do, I've revamped the supporting listeners program, get all kinds of just ridiculous how many benefits you get now. Supportinglisteners.com. That's the website. Supportinglisteners.com is how you join my elite group, and you'll also find out about the special event there. I probably will give out the details soonish. It's going to be on Murray Rothbard's birthday, March 3rd, and I'd like people to be there, and I'm being a bit circumspect about the details, so just leave it there. So if you want to come, get on my email list and you'll find out the details. Or join the supporting listeners program. Likewise, you'll find them out in the private group. Okay, well, with that mysterious remark having been made, I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.